So there's one more detail we need to add to this before we can really make use of it. And that's that studio lights are never uniformly bright all the way across, right? You get kind of a hot spot in the middle and it fades out toward the edges. Now that kind of detail might not seem like a big deal, but when you're using glossy materials and you're seeing reflections of objects in a scene, they're going to look much more realistic if those edges can fade out realistically. Now we can make this as complex or as simple as we want it to be. We're going to start with a really simple edge fade to begin with. And then it's going to get more interesting and more complex as we progress. But for now, let's just start with something real simple. So to do an edge fade, let's go to our model viewport. I'm going to select that mesh item and hit Control 2 on my keyboard and head over to my vertex map shading mode. So it's this kind of uglyish green color. But what's nice about it is that's going to allow us to see our weight map as we apply it. We'll go down to our Lists tab over here. I'm going to click on Weight Maps, New Map, and we'll call this Edge Fade 1. Now, this is going to be a weight map. We click OK. And by default, that weight map is now selected in our lists. So anything that we do with it will now be applied to that weight map if we run the weight tool. Now, let's start a fall off. We'll do a radial fall off. Click in the viewport to get it started, and then we'll just numerically set this. We want the center to be at 0, 0, 0 to start. And we want the size. Let's set those to be equal, and it'll be a radius value. So let's do 0.5 meters. So it's exactly the size of our object, because it happens to be a 1 meter object. And then we'll head up to our vertex map menu and down to the weight tool. Now all we have to do is click in the viewport at weight equals 100%, and it's going to set 100% weight in the middle and fade perfectly straight out to the edges. And let's just double check something about our fall off. Let's make sure that our shape preset is set to linear. That way we have a linear fall off from 100% in the middle to 0% in the outside, and then we can control that fall off using what's called a bias, but we'll get there in just a second. So I'll hit the space bar to drop that tool, hit the escape key to get rid of our fall off. Now we have a weight map to work with. Let's add it to our scene. So we'll go up to our shader tree, and in our light poly group, let's add layer and processing. And you might think this is a gradient, but it's not. Instead of gradient, let's go down to weight map texture. And in the weight map texture properties, let's set its vertex map property to edge fade 1. So it's using that edge fade. And it's going to define not the diffuse color, but basic channels, luminous amount. Now, we don't want it to actually define the luminous amount. We don't want it to set how bright our light is, right? Because right in the middle here, it's going to be a value of 1, and on the edge, it's going to be a value of 0, and then, you know, that's going to override our brightness value. What we want for it to do is just darken the edges of whatever brightness happens to be in the middle. So let's set this, instead of normal blend mode, let's set that to multiply. That way it's taking whatever value is inherently underneath it and just multiplying it in order to get it closer to 0. If we turn on Ray GL here, you can see now we have the edges of this darkened. Okay? And we can actually adjust this guy. And if we want to adjust that fade, then we can use this thing called the bias. If we set that bias really low, then you can see it's fading just a little bit on the edges. If we set that bias really high, say 90%, then all of a sudden we're only glowing in the middle and most of the light is not illuminated at all. 50%, of course, is the default, so it's going to remain linear from one side to the other. So with that, let's just rig this into our light setup. We'll go to our Setup tab. And first of all, we need to go to our Layout, Palettes, Groups. We have our light poly group here. We need to add this weight map texture to our group. So let's take that and drop it in our group so that we have that here. So it gets saved out with our assembly. Now we need to control this. So let's put it over here next to our controls. We need one of its properties. Let's say its opacity. Let's drag that on. And we also want that other one, the bias. Drag that out. Perfect. So let's go to our controls, add user channel, This one we'll call edge fade bias. And that'll be a float. Actually, no, it'll be a percentage. And we will use a minimum value of 0, a maximum value of 100, and the default value of 50. Hit OK. And let's add one more user channel. This one's going to be edge fade opacity, and that's a percentage as well. Hit OK. We'll take that bias, we'll drop it in there. Take that opacity, drop it in there. And now, when we're in our viewport, if we select our controls, we can set our opacity up to 100%, so it's very visible, or 0%, so there's no edge fade at all. But by default, we'll leave it at 50, so there's just a little bit of edge fade visible. Perfect. Now we can actually start to make use of this light rig.